Good morning all, and welcome to our webinar today, dealing with, I guess, a few topics, but primarily financial corporate crime, and how that has changed, or if it has changed since COVID-19. My name's Adam Sims. I'm a partner at BDO Forensic in Sydney. I'm also a New South Wales financial crime solicitor. In a previous life, I was a career police detective, where I dealt with a lot of fraud, money laundering and issues such as that. And I did that prior to embarking on a legal career, so that's my background. Presently, I provide investigation, risk management advisory services to private and public sector. I basically specialise in investigations, corruption matters, fraud, money laundering, terrorism, financing, and workplace investigations. I have with me online my colleague Andrew Howard from Brisbane. Morning, Andrew.
Morning, Adam. Thanks for that. My name's Andrew Howard, as Adam mentioned. I'm in our Brisbane office. I've been at BDO about 15 years now. The bulk of that time in forensic services. Spent time obviously based here in Brisbane. Also had a few years in our London office, which was a really good experience. Prior to coming to BDO, I worked for a national transport company in the commercial world. So I'm one of those rare accountants that have gone from commercial to chartered. It seems to be normally the other way around. Much like Adam, my focus is on financial crime, fraud investigations, and also litigation support.
Thanks, Andrew. Okay, today, what we want to try to do is bring together a couple of associated themes. In the initial part, please bear with me. I probably get a little bit distracted talking about some context. We run through a bit of a timeline around COVID, and then we look at what we are seeing as practitioners to round off, and at the end, a bit of an approach in your response, or what you should be looking at in terms of corporate crime during these times. Pre-COVID, we saw regulation on the rise. Corporate crime was actually being redefined and reinforced in areas of governance and obligation on directors in particular. Then the pandemic hit, pretty much without warning, I've got to say, and the world was thrown into this strange new order. And after going through what was about a 3-month hiatus, although it seemed to go very quickly, we are where we are today. And I guess you probably feel the same as I do. It's a bit of an unknown. You know, we've had the health crisis, and now we're going through sensibly a financial crisis concurrently with what I term a social crisis. And there's all sorts of societal malaise out there, and getting clarity around that is difficult. But whilst the world was forced in respect to all that effectively to turn off for a while, in the eyes of some, it was seen as the perfect opportunity to steal, exploit, and in some cases, maybe not an opportunity, but a mechanism to survive, what we see anyway. There's no doubt that we've been forced into this new way of life, and sorry, I keep using that phrase, but it's true, and things will no doubt continue to be very different for a long time, and in a lot of ways that we probably don't fully understand. It takes me back, and the reason I've got the black swan there is to a book I read many years ago, around 2007. There was a book called The Black Swan, funny enough, and I'll read an excerpt from that, and it's just quite eerie how he knew that something like this may happen. He said, so Talib was the author, and he said, they are unpredictable, black swans. They carry massive impact, and after the fact, we concoct an explanation that makes it appear less random than it was. He also said that we as a society are hardwired not to truly estimate risk. We're too vulnerable to the impulse to simplify, narrate, and categorize, and not open enough to be rewarding those who can imagine the impossible. How true and how prophetic. You only have to watch the Netflix doco called Pandemic to see how uncomfortably prescient warnings about COVID-19 were. And if you haven't seen it, I really recommend it. Bit of a timeline. So, obviously the transnational nature of our world has allowed this virus to spread in unprecedented fashion and with ease and very quickly. January, I remember very distinctly, Monday the 13th of January, I was in a lift with one of my colleagues and I was asking him how his Christmas break had been. And he said to me, I've just returned from a place called Wuhan in China. Now, at that time, it was getting some mentions in the news, but nothing like it has been, and certainly not as well known as it is now. And I said to him, "Oh, I actually vaguely remember hearing something about that. Where is it?" And we had a discussion around it, and he mentioned the pandemic at that point, which was really just a localized spreading, they thought. And then 2 weeks later, he and his family were put into quarantine. Now, I wasn't contacted by anyone, and I'm not just being disparaging against anyone here. I'm really pointing out that at that point in time, we didn't know what was before us and what was to come. And it's little wonder that the virus has spread in the way that it has, given the early stages. So January, the news started to travel around Wuhan, and the World Health Organization at some point late in January declared a public health emergency. So it wasn't a pandemic at that time, but red flag, be aware, it's coming. We get into February, much of the same. We start hearing in the news things about Australians being on ships caught off the coast of countries in Europe, etc. Italy starts talking about the large number of cases it has. It's starting to get serious at that point in time. Then we hit March, and March really was the epicenter of the pandemic, as I recall it anyway, and I'm pretty sure you probably agree with that. It was kind of like a modern Armageddon in some respects. So at that point in March, World Health Organization at some point in early to mid, I think it's on the 11th there, declares the global pandemic. Borders gradually close, global cases are on the increase massively, hundreds of thousands, the death toll, tens of thousands. Locally we're seeing mass job losses, businesses forced all of a sudden to work remotely, lockdown, this new term, social distancing. Queensland closes its borders, and the world's changed before our eyes. I know with myself and my team, one day we're in the office and the next day we're having to work out this remote situation where we need to be at home and work from home. Challenging times. Then April, much of the same, but I think in April we started to adjust somewhat. There were, further state border closures. The government kicked in its stimulus packages, introduced them as part of the financial crisis I spoke about earlier. And then we sort of hit May and June. We saw ongoing restrictions, but again, we became accustomed to the way of life which we now reside in. In June, I should say that we entered the recession, a recession, which was the first recession that we've had in 29 or 30 years. We were starting to see more media reports around households that couldn't afford rent and basic necessities, further assistance being provided to those renters and to mortgagees, etc. And it was getting very complicated. And then the realization that, okay, yes, we're offsetting the need to pay rent or the need to pay mortgage, but the reality is at some point those debts are going to be realized later in time and they will have to be paid. Now we're in July. We're facing, what looks to be a second wave of this virus, certainly in Victoria. Anyone dialing in from Victoria, our thoughts are with you. I hope everything's okay down there. And now, Victoria's isolated from the rest of the country. Just crazy, crazy times. So that's the context. What now I want to talk about, and I'll completely go on another tangent, is the term financial crime, because what I then want to do is bring these two together. And it's important that we understand what we're talking about here. I can say to you, we're here to talk about financial and corporate crime, but really, what is that? Traditionally, we think white collar crime, we think executives committing crimes. Well, yeah, okay, it's a bit different. these days. There are many comparisons, I have to say, to what's happening now in the global financial crisis in 2008. So, if you recall, and you may or may not know this, but after the GFC, we saw a huge increase in corporate crime cases surfacing. Some of them were what caused the crash, and they became realised at the point of the crash or slightly after. But there was an even more significant increase in post-crash corporate crime. This led basically to decades worth of corporate crime investigations and prosecutions, and I'll speak about that a little bit more. Financial crime is not just about fraud and corruption, which are arguably the most serious in nature of the behaviours that we as financial crime specialists look at. But in recent times, financial crime has broadened, and the role of the C-suite and certainly the boards and in government, the government executive, in the management of the response to these crimes has never been so demanding and enduring under what I call the spotlight of transparency that we find ourselves in today. This little schematic is obviously a board, and the various issues that they have to consider, and a lot of those you'll be familiar with, and if not, have a look and make a note and do a bit of research. So I want to just go back to the GFC quickly. Since the GFC, there has been a real push, and there was a real push, making directors accountable for the criminal behaviour that exists within the organisation. The idea was that if adequate procedures were put in place, criminal behaviour would be minimised. We never really had anything to drive that, so it's been a bit hit and miss. It's been a bit of a something that I've been focused on more lately, around getting awareness out there to the board, to directors, to government executive around their obligations. We see it done better in the public sector than we do the private sector. But change is coming. Acknowledgement in the law is where adequate procedures can be used. They are used, and if they are put in place, they are seen as a total defence for directors to crimes committed within their organisations. We don't see that in Australia, but it is coming. So on the 2nd of December 2019, the Australian government introduced the, I have to remember this right, Combating Corporate Crime Bill into Parliament. So the bill basically introduces a new corporate offence for failing to prevent an associate of the corporate, so anyone related to the business, from committing foreign bribery offences by having adequate procedures. So what they're doing is duplicating, for those of you that know, in the UK, we have something called the Bribery Act, which governs bribery and corruption in the UK. In that jurisdiction, there are adequate procedures. There's adequate procedures defence, and what the government had to do in that jurisdiction was issue a guidance around what does that mean? What do corporates need to put in place to help navigate what adequate procedures are, and to detailed guidance to help directors understand what's required from the legislation. So I guess in terms of the legislation that is currently in Parliament, it is coming, and I expect it hasn't been spoken about yet, but I expect there'll be some guidance issued around what adequate procedures are, and I strongly suspect it'll be it will mirror what is happening in the UK, or what's been issued in the UK, which is actually a very useful and good guidance. They say, and I don't know who says it, but they say there are 3 jobs you don't want: Prime Minister of Australia, to be a director, or a senior executive of an Australian public company. I guess you'll agree, given the recent turnover of prime ministers in this country, and not to mention the media focus that role gets, the demands on the PM's role are significant. But do you know this? You would still have more of a chance of going to jail, seeing photos of yourself and your family in the paper, if you're a member of a board, a C-suite, or a government executive officer in an organisation that has done wrong. And that is the modern day reality. We live in transparent times, and if you're covering something up, it will be uncovered soon enough. And you've only got to look to the Panama Papers or the Paradise Papers to understand that concept. Pre-COVID, so I'll just before we sort of hit into COVID, there was a real change in the legislative regimes in this country governing corporate responsibility, and there is now a myriad of responsibilities that can be seen in organisations that have, in some cases, criminal consequences for directors. The Australian Institute of Company Directors, the AICD, issues very good guidance around these obligations. So if any of those topics there you're unfamiliar with, or the obligations, if you are a director in company or government, please have a look at the website. It's very, very useful. So think about that and add this to the mix. We've got the GFC. We've got company directors, government executives facing a really serious challenge in COVID. What we're seeing anyway, even companies that are traditionally or historically strong are suddenly struggling and becoming potential business failures. So the pressure's on. There is a lot of pressure out there. But for directors, the pressure is especially so because they have to decide what to do immediately, but also having regard to the long-term implications for their decisions. And as I speculated earlier, like we don't really know what we're facing at the moment, and to be able to predict where things are going is very difficult. And again, all this is going on where we have, as I've alluded to, and we're going to go into this a bit further now, we've got the perfect storm, what I call the perfect storm for traditional corporate criminal activity to flourish. And we'll talk about that now. Andrew, did you want to talk to this slide?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. As you saw on that previous slide, the boards and directors certainly have a lot to think about, particularly around corruption, fraud, cybercrime, workplace misbehaviour, all sorts of things to consider. But what about, or I guess what we want to touch on now is, I guess, the individuals that are involved in perpetrating fraud, corruption, cybercrimes, those sorts of things. This may be a model that some of you are familiar with. It's the fraud triangle, which originated from American socialist Donald Cresey. It's a really good, I think, snapshot of the sorts of people that would normally commit fraud. The video team, we've investigated hundreds of fraud matters over the years, and I can honestly say in every single instance, we can relate the fraud back to this model, and often it can be related to two or more elements of the triangle. So the various elements, as they kind of named, opportunities, essentially where the belief that the individual can perpetrate a fraud and will probably get away with it due to poor internal controls, lack of enforcement, or adherence to internal controls, or just a general lack of fraud control strategies. Some examples may include employees that, for example, identify that stock takes are not completed, and they could go on to steal IT equipment, or that timesheets are not reviewed and subsequently put in fraudulent timesheets. Incentive and pressure on the individual can quite often contribute to fraud being committed. It's the motivation behind the crime or the fraud in the first instance, and generally relates to personal pressures. Examples can include financial pressures relating from gambling or drug addictions through to supporting, I guess, extravagant lifestyles. Unfortunately, what we normally see in these instances is the pressures seen by the individual essentially is an unsolvable issue that they can't get past. Unfortunately, instead of the individual perhaps seeking additional help through other channels or alternative channels to try and get help out of difficult situations, whether it's financial pressure or an addiction. As I said before, they feel like there's no way out and perhaps turn to fraud as a way to kind of ease that pressure. Probably the third element, rationalisation, refers to the ability, I guess, for the individual to rationalise the crime. So quite often, fraudsters are first-time criminals and perhaps don't really see themselves as criminals, but perhaps maybe a victim of circumstance. So they're starting to rationalise, I guess, internally what they're doing. And whether or not it's acceptable per their internal, I guess, moral compass. But again, Some examples might include someone committing fraud and I guess rationalising in their head by saying, well, I needed to take care of my family, a sick family member, I was overlooked for a promotion, or it might just be, well, everyone else does it, so why can't I? The company or the government agency can afford it. I'll only do it once. I'm not hurting anyone. I'm not hurting an individual. So they're all things, I guess all three of those elements that we quite often see. Probably a recent matter that the team worked on really kind of brought home a couple of these elements. I just want to kind of share with you the case study. It involved an individual that stole $2 million from an organisation. They were a long-term employee, had been there for 6 years plus. They were really seen as a saint of this organisation. Everyone looked up to them. They were very well respected. They quite early identified a control gap around the vetting of new vendors. So they weren't being checked properly. They were easy to set up in the system. And then subsequent invoices weren't really being looked at in too much detail either. So that there was their opportunity. So what individual did was probably guess, set up a number of fake vendors and then started submitting, excuse me, fake invoices. The invoices started off quite small, I guess not to raise too many eyebrows or raise too much suspicion. But over time, as all the invoices kept getting approved and paid, the quantum of the invoices got bigger and bigger and bigger, to the point where the organisation came under severe cash flow pressure, which was really the catalyst or the trigger for the investigation. As part of the investigation, the stolen funds were traced back to holidays, jewellery, new cars, and even investment property. So it was quite clear that the individual in this case was living extravagant lifestyle, which I guess was the incentive or the pressure element of the fraud triangle. So as I said, with all the matters that we've investigated in the past, we can always bring it back to one or two elements of this fraud triangle. Interestingly enough, the individual in that case got sentenced to 10 years, and I think they said 5 or 6 in the end. But if we overlay COVID-19 against the fraud triangle, as Adam mentioned before, we almost get the perfect storm. When COVID first hit, I guess like everyone else, myself and Adam were caught off guard, and it was just that whole new, I guess, world of having to work from home, doing things remotely, doing things differently, even giving seminars via webcams and MS Teams like we are today, as opposed to the old-fashioned get up in front of people. But I guess Adam and I kind of referred to it again as the perfect storm. It is a little bit similar to the GFC, but I guess people working from home creates a whole new range of risk and opportunities. So, for example, internal controls could be weakened because people are working from home. There's no direct supervision. Reduction in work hours can potentially lead to an increase, for example, in timesheet fraud. People not being able to, I guess, vet or review invoices that are coming through because everyone's got to work remotely. So I guess the sudden remote working conditions is really placed intense strain on a control environment, again, increasing the opportunity for fraud and corruption. Operating remotely has really, I guess in our view and what we're seeing, eroded standard controls, especially with the segregation of duties like financial functions, which are so key and critical. We're starting to see breakdown in the verification processes around goods and services, particularly those that are being delivered. And people are starting to come up with, I guess, procedural workarounds. So where there may have been some good, robust internal controls initially, when people were in the office or on site. Because people are now working remotely, we're seeing people and individuals come up with all sorts of wonderful and unique ways to get around these controls. And it's just becoming more and more common. I guess at the same time, there's certainly a bigger emphasis on financial distress, again, as there was during the GFC. And this is perhaps resulting in greater incentive for employees or suppliers or customers to potentially commit fraud, particularly if there's households that have gone from 2 incomes down to 1, or 1 income, where people may have taken a 20% reduction or 30% reduction in pay. It's really what we're seeing is that's really putting an increased pressure on people's finances. I guess as businesses strive to stay solvent, obviously jobs have been cut again. This may make the rationalisation for some people to commit fraud a little bit more easy for them to do it. I guess, again, we come back to, I need to take the money or I need to do this to look after my family. So I guess, as the slide says, I think, Adam, you'll agree, in our view, it really is the perfect storm. And we're seeing organisations, again, that once had some really good internal robust controls, putting the employees in a different environment, i.e. working from home, is creating a lot of risks and, again, potential opportunities for people to commit fraud.
Yeah, indeed. And I like your terminology, the procedural workarounds. I think we've seen certainly a lot of cases where they've been exploited and perpetrators actually taking that to mean, yeah, we can actually commit a fraud. And we'll give some examples of that soon.
Yeah.
Right. Thanks, Andrew. KPMG recently did a COVID-19 crime threat survey, which I thought was a good initiative. I like to use KPMG's fraud barometer for 2 reasons. It's a good solid piece and it's very useful, and the other reason was I used to work on it when I worked with KPMG, so I do like the product. Have a look at that. I mean, it's pretty obvious what it's saying in its assessment. Suppliers being one of the key risks for the business. Employees, for all the reasons Andrew has told you about, again, being a key risk for fraud and other misconduct in the business. To a lesser extent, contractors, agents, and indeed customers. No surprises there, I suppose. 42% of executives said that their ability to conduct investigations into activity, either whether it be fraud or corruption or misconduct, was inhibited by COVID-19, which surprised me. And 27% of executives said that their organisation had to delay fraud and corruption prevention programs. That doesn't surprise me. What does surprise me about that actual figure is that it's so low, because from my experience, we're seeing that a lot higher. Issues driving a rise in fraud and corruption risk during COVID-19. There you go. I mean, all the stuff we just spoke about before. Nothing too surprising there.
Even from I guess a practical point, Adam, I know we've had a lot of inquiries recently off the back of COVID-19, where we're seeing clients and organisations again struggle with people working from home. So, some of the recent, I guess, inquiries that we're seeing, particularly around timesheet fraud, again because it's a little bit difficult to I guess supervise employees when they're off-site, invoice or fake creditor payments coming through, again because people can't perhaps physically see the goods that are arriving, or people aren't physically seeing the invoice. They're just logging on to online banking platforms because the payment needs to be cleared, and they're relying on someone else to say yes, it's okay. So again, it's this perfect storm where it's creating, I guess, lots of opportunity to get around previously existing controls.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. COVID-19. I like this. A crime pandemic. These are some of the headlines, not all of them, obviously. The hot tub scam at the top there represents a genre of crime that is not unusual, but on the increase massively, and that's really online shopping. Basically, products that never existed, people paying for them and never receiving them. That has gone through the roof. The stimulus scam. So we've got the super early super release. We've got job seeker. There are a number of frauds being committed and a large number of frauds being committed around those programs. Thankfully, the ATO is on to that. They've actually created a task force called the Serious Financial Crime Task Force, the FSCT. It primarily focuses on any sort of crime relating to these stimulus packages at the moment. What I'm hearing from them directly is that what they're seeing is things like people applying when there is no change to regular salary, regular wage, or employment information. There has been people artificially arranging their affairs to meet the eligibility criteria, and I mean, I guess you'll probably agree none of this is really startling. It was expected. People making false statements or fraudulent attempts to meet the eligibility criteria, people withdrawing and I like this one, people withdrawing and recontributing super for a tax advantage. There's also been cases of identity theft, which the AFP are looking at, and basically what happened there is policyholders were starting to receive SMSs around their super, telling them that their release had been approved, and they never actually applied. What actually happened was the AFP investigated, and there was a third-party system storing all personal details that had actually been the subject of a cyber attack and intruded, and the information was obtained, and the fraud committed that way. And then the bottom one down there, I did have an audio to play you of a telephone scam. We just can't get it to come through to you, so sorry, apologies for that. But this is the worst kind of fraud, I think, when you look at it, because it's really playing at the vulnerability of people who are feeling susceptible to losing their job under financial hardship. And basically the recording is, it's a telephone message left, and the message talks about the fact that the recipient of the call is currently the subject of a lawsuit, and that there are arrest warrants going to be issued, and that the caller says, and we will get you arrested. Now, I mean, people in our business know that a lawsuit and arrest warrants don't go hand in hand. You don't get arrested for a lawsuit, but a lot of people don't understand that. And you put yourself in the shoes of someone who's facing the dilemma of mounting bills, being able to afford, going through the stress of that, the psychological trauma of all that, and suddenly getting a call like this. They're vulnerable to it. And would you believe there's a lot of people, tens of thousands of dollars has been lost to this type of scam. What you don't see in the news, though, is the internal threat. So, all this is external, and the media portrays this, but what you don't see is the internal threat. And so what we're seeing is, I'll give you a case of a $5 million fraud we looked at that had been bubbling away for years. Now, due to the need to make an assessment on cash holdings, etc., some analytics done on the financials, and this $5 million fraud was uncovered. It resulted from a accountant who had no controls, pretty much free reign over the finances, and his $70 million gambling habit. So in a 4-year period, he took from the business $5 million. In that time, he generated an online banking account which he put through $70 million. Phenomenal. And the printout of all the transactions was about 40 odd centimeters high in a pile of sheets, and the activity was daily and every couple of minutes. I don't know how he did his job, but A prime example of what we were talking about with the fraud triangle, in this case being, gambling. We've seen the theft of computers from a company who really didn't have time to set up for their employees working from home. So basically, carte blanche, take equipment you need. Thousands of dollars worth of equipment now missing. We saw a case where there was a kickback for work preferences within a business where the employees were being stood down, put on leave, etc. But some needed to be maintained. So there were some kickbacks going internally around who got the work. And an interesting case where we saw a finance employee who, she forgot to change back the vendor banking details when she was putting in her own accounts, own account information, and analytics picked it up. And basically it turned out that she didn't have time to change it back because the business shut down so dramatically with COVID-19. Andrew, I'm sure you're seeing some similar stuff out of Brisbane there too with this sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. We've just finished some analytics jobs where we were looking at just that. It was around changes of bank accounts, and we were looking at any changes that have essentially occurred outside of business hours. And while that would be a normal test, I guess with any sort of investigation that we would do, put across a different lens of people working from home. And yeah, you might get some people logging on at 7 o'clock in the morning, or perhaps working a little bit later in the afternoon because they don't have that commute, or they might have got a little bit distracted at lunch, so they decided to do a little bit of extra work in the afternoon to make up for it. So all those sorts of things are, I guess, perfectly normal. But what we are seeing is, even though people are working from home or working remotely, we are still seeing some changes in bank account details go through at 10 o'clock at night, 3 a.m. in the morning, and regardless of COVID-19 or not, that would still be a red flag for us.
Indeed. The workplace. So we've been looking at workplace behaviour software for a while, seeing how we can apply that for client solution. And I've got to say that that's been a difficult process given COVID-19 now, because all that's out the window. Late hours are becoming the norm. Odd hours are becoming the norm. People are at home having to deal with family issues during the day, so decide to work at night. So yeah, everything's changed, hasn't it? Right. COVID-19, the crime risk response needs to be adaptive and versatile. That's exactly right. But you might find the solution not so different to what you've already been doing. So how has the approach changed? The prevention, detection, response model I've got there is pretty much more important than ever. It hasn't changed, so it remains as a result of COVID-19. I've highlighted some particular areas that we are seeing as more focal points, and the need for emphasis needs to be placed on these. With businesses tightening spending, as we've said, government tightening spending, the existence of control weaknesses is becoming more apparent, and that perfect storm is being created through that. And this is where vigilance is needed. Now, what we have seen during COVID is that there's been a trend against undertaking reviews like fraud and risk assessments. The classic comment is, look, we've got no budget for it. We're worried about the spend. Our attention, one client said, well, our attention's drawn to something more significant. Fair enough, I get it, and overwhelming. But the fact remains, and this is a conversation I was having with that client, was that in times of adversity like this, conditions open the door to criminality, and this is where the business becomes more susceptible. So whilst you're trying to remain solvent, by ignoring your fraud threat, you're actually opening the door for money going out the door in that way. So you want to stop it. Now, I mentioned the 2008 GFC, and I'll go back to it again, and I keep raising it for a very specific reason, because the conditions that existed then were similar, and the constraints placed on governance arrangements to fraud risk the approach was very similar. We saw a similar sort of thing. It's funny how we revert back to our ways and not learn from the past. The result was then, so with the curtailment of fraud risk measures, the result was then that fraud went through the roof. I will point out two things though in terms of the GFC, and they're two differences that are worth flagging. One is a positive, and one's probably, you know, the impact of COVID-19 is more significant. So since 2008, there's been a far more extensive regulatory environment. In 2008, we didn't have a lot of these, right? Or before that. So that creates a large deterrent effect, and that didn't exist previously. The regulators, you know, the likes of ASIC, AUSTRAC, APRA, they've been quick to state during COVID-19 that some of the pragmatic advice suggesting they are, they're issuing pragmatic advice suggesting they are reprioritising their enforcement. Okay, that's fine. You know, they don't want to stall the recovery process, but they've issued a caution that diluting existing controls where they exist will be something they will focus on when things come back online. So there's a word of caution there. The other thing is, unlike in 2008, we've suffered major personnel and time management challenges, no doubt about that. And these things are something we've never seen before, limiting the effectiveness of the corporate crime governance processes we have in place. Performing risk assessments, let's face it, has been difficult, if not impossible in some cases. Majority of directors and senior personnel are more focused on survival, as I said, and it's understandable that the tone from the top might be busy elsewhere in the short term. Lastly, and related, of course, is the fact that we have the workforce reduced, you know, and to, you know, people working from home, reduced hours. It poses significant control weaknesses, which we've spoken about already. And then, you know, again, another factor in all this is the difficulty in carrying out due diligence checks with customers and vendors particularly, and we're going to talk more further. We'll talk more about that. 4i reviews on invoicing and financials disappeared in some cases. Training, you know, has been stopped or halted. I was only speaking to a client yesterday where we were talking about training, and they said, look, you know, as COVID-19, we had all this planned, but had to be put on hold. And then lastly, undertaking investigations, which we'll speak about soon, has been very difficult. And we had a number of investigations actually ready to go, which have been put on hold. Really, it's a bit of pill to swallow, given that the fraudulent behaviour is increasing, and we're seeing circumstances that are actually allowing it to go ahead. We need to be, and everyone needs to be highly diligent in this time. There needs to be a greater emphasis on resilience in terms of fraud. So what are we talking about in terms of prevention? Nothing's changed really here. I do want to talk to you about some of the highlighted topics that I just had there. And I too want to talk to you about the new revision of the Australian standard on fraud and corruption control. I'm actually a committee member on that change, and there's some significant changes coming. Let's go back to financial crime risk assessments and how they're applying to COVID. They need to be revisited with COVID, and a COVID lens needs to be put on it for all the reasons we've spoken about. There are things that you can do to ensure you're protecting your assets and your business and your revenue, and it needs to be considered in a COVID with a COVID lens. So you can ensure that there is adequate segregation of duties between functions in the business, things like the ability to maintain normal segregation between functions being impaired by staff reductions. You know, look at implementing a workaround that allows for some overarching supervision. That is getting missed more and more, and we're seeing a lot of that occurring, creating vulnerabilities. Follow up identified anomalies. We're getting approached to a lot of data analytics around cash flow and anomalies coming up, where we're seeing a lot of red flags, and investigations will start arising out of that. Ensure you have to allocate that responsibility to someone in the business. So where anomalies arise, they need to be followed up. Gain an understanding of any gaps in the control framework and look to plug those gaps, of course. Take steps to secure assets. I told you about the example where, you know, assets have gone missing. Asset register in that case wasn't in existence. You need an asset register. Ensure that your employees are aware of their obligations. Policies, procedures need to be toned from the top, I guess we're talking about here, needs to be put in place, and people need to understand what their obligations are. You need to create a framework in the current environment that is is open to the fact that if unethical behaviour is occurring, it will be followed up and action will be taken. You're not dealing with the COVID response and that in entirety. You are also dealing with any other matters that come up, especially if they're resulting from unethical behaviour. I mean, that's not a comprehensive list, and clearly your fraud risk assessment, fraud and corruption risk assessment will tell you more about your business in terms of that. The other area that was highlighted is third parties. Now, this is particularly important in the current environment. With international travel restrictions, slow mail channel, we're seeing a lot of businesses needing to engage new third parties and vendors to undertake work that was previously given or done from overseas entities. The risk here, and we've seen this a number of times now, is that due diligence is not carried out. There's an urgent need to have these entities replaced, and we're seeing that the procedures in place for managing that risk are not being adhered to. And again, it's due to the urgency, it's due to the fact that there's lack of funds or concern over spending, diverted attention, of course, onto COVID. What you're going to have, and what we've already seen, is that the third party does something wrong. It either costs you, your organisation, money, reputation, or worse yet, implicates your business in corrupt, or your government department in corrupt conduct. The first thing the DPP, whether it be Commonwealth or state, will ask is that, why didn't you follow the procedures you had in place? And I can tell you now, it's not going to be an excuse to say, well, there's a lack of funds, we were concerned about spend, or, well, our attention was focused to COVID-19. The regulator's been very clear that if you have a program in place, you need to adhere to it. There was an instance where we had a local government affiliated trust who engaged a vendor for a very large construction project, which clearly got put on hold. Timelines were being blown out as a result of someone new being appointed. Basically, it turns out that whilst fraud wasn't occurring, that individual company was purporting to be something that it wasn't, and some basic due diligence that we were able to do uncovered that it was basically a sole operator operating out of his home, not well established, and the resultant lack of being able to meet deadlines was a result of that. A prime example, very poignant example as to the issues that arise when you don't follow proper due diligence around your third parties. The COVID response has provided some reprieve, I should say, for directors' duty. So I'll caveat what I'm saying with this. So insolvent trading has been basically okayed for a 6-month period. However, fraudulent trading is still not okay. There can be a very fine line between these two concepts, and you need to be alive to the difference. Be mindful of the balance sheet in the vendors that you're seeking to use. Ask questions about delays in payments, etc. Do your due diligence with any new vendors you take on. It's very important. It goes to the next point where we talk about culture and tone from the top, and I probably harped on a bit about that. I don't know if any of you have heard of Clinton Free. He's a professor at the Uni of Sydney, and he's done some research around rationalisation. And basically what he did as part of his study is he went through the jails and interviewed perpetrators of fraud and large frauds, and to find out, what was their drive. And basically the study has found that the medium fraud is not only is it committed over a 2-year period, but it's uncovered through tip-offs. It concluded too that whilst it's good to have controls in place, they're not at the be-all and end-all. So the study wasn't saying don't have controls. In fact, it was saying definitely have controls. But what he found through that study was that the rationalisation became more of a factor around the commission of the offences that were done. And there's something called nudge thinking and behavioural science, so ideas of anti-rationalisation that were really pointing to what is delivered through culture and leadership within a company. And the key divider with these things was things like, fraud awareness at inductions, making it very clear that the company will not tolerate fraud. Regular awareness training on the back of that. Things like workplace surveillance, like having cameras in place as a deterrent, again, sending the message that it won't be tolerated, and regular emails, funny enough, from senior managers stipulating that, this conduct will not be tolerated and will be investigated. that's a bit of a paradigm shift, because we've always thought having pure controls in place is going to solve everything, but it doesn't. And anyone that's been involved in fraud investigations will know that predominantly you'll investigate a matter and controls have been in place, but they've been circumvented. So nudge thinking, tone from the top is very important, and the studies are showing that. As I mentioned, I was on the committee for I am on the committee for the Australian standard changing, and there's some significant changes that are about to be released. I should say that the standard is in draft form at the moment, and you have until the end of this month to provide public comment. So if you're unaware of this, or you're unaware that you could provide public comment, do a Google search for AS 8001. Draft, go to the standards website, access the draft standard and have a look at it. And if you have any comments, please make them. There's provision on the website, standards website, where you can make some comments. And when we meet next, which is next month, I believe, we will be considering the public comments and adding those where we feel they should be added. I'll just mention very quickly, I don't want to, you could do a whole hour on this, but I just mentioned some of the changes that we're looking at as part of that standard. So there's the introduction of the concept of minimum requirements, and I've spoken about minimum requirements or alluded to it during this presentation. The new standard as drafted stipulates that organisations shall do certain things in order to comply with the standard, rather than currently used expression, which is should. So the new standard talks about shall. It's a harder language. It's putting more obligation back on to corporates to adhere to the standard. We talk now about fraud and corruption control system as opposed to the fraud and corruption control plan. So the control plan, that as we know it, is out the door. I think all of you will agree that you had some participation in a fraud and corruption control plan. They're often developed and put on the shelf to gather dust, not usually implemented. So we now talk about a fraud and corruption control system. Have a read of that, have a read of what it is, and again, if you have any comments about that before the 29th of this month, please provide them so we can consider that. There's some harmonisation of the new fraud and corruption standard with the international standard on anti-bribery and management. Basically, it's just providing consistency between the international standard and the local standard, so that when you are developing these programs where they apply, you don't have to go off on different tangents. Have a read of that as well, it's very important. There's some updated definitions for fraud and corruption. Again, we've looked broader to include activity that may not necessarily be illegal, but can impact reputational damage. There's updated guidance around preventing, detecting and responding to external attacks, basically cyberborne attacks. Very important and obviously very relevant in the current environment. There are normative references to other standards, and what I mean by that is there's about 8, I think, all up within the new fraud and corruption standard that talk about normative standards. So if you say you are complying with the new fraud and corruption standard, you have to actually comply with the other normative standards that exist. And one of them is the information technology systems, management systems, I think it's called, standard. And if you don't comply with that, then you can't comply with the fraud and corruption risk standard. Again, we've put some stuff in there around what I've spoken about, you know, top line management and governing body and tone from the top. And there's a new concept called pressure testing. So those of you who are aware of the term penetration testing, this is very similar to that, where you kind of, in that case where you've got a white hacker attacking your system in a technology sense, this will be a similar concept, but you'll be looking at the controls around fraud and corruption risk within the business. Have a read of that, it's very interesting. That, as I said, is due to come out next month.
So
Andrew,
just,
I'll
just wanted to kind of add to that quickly, how important that standard is, and I guess the 3 pillars of prevention, detection, and response, which that standard covers. To put it into, I guess, a real life scenario, we've got the team's investigated a fairly large fraud here. at the moment in excess of $1 million, but it looks like they may not get relief under their insurance policy. And the insurers kicked back because there was inadequate prevention and detection controls in place and processes in place to, I guess, minimise the risk in the first instance. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out over the next couple of months. But yeah, unfortunately, yeah, potentially $1 million under the policy that won't be paid out. So again, just highlights the importance of that standard, I think. In terms of detection, probably the main area we wanted to focus on here is data analytics. In my 15 or 17 years or so working in this space, this has certainly been the biggest change I've seen in my career. So if I kind of rewind to probably the very first fraud investigation I was involved with, it was literally tracing checks. There were handwriting experts in the room to determine what signatures were real and which ones were forged. We were tracing back to invoices and other documents in dusty old archive boxes. So it was a really kind of, I guess, a good example of rolling the sleeves up and really getting your hands dirty, looking for transactions. Fast forward to 2020, and it's all around data analytics and visualization now, and it's used really as a prevention and also detection. Again, fast forward to 2020, recent example of a matter that we worked on. I think we had in excess of 9.2 million lines of data, which we used analytics to identify various outliers, which then, I guess, provided focus and clarity on the areas that we need to drill down on very quickly. So again, if we were doing something like that manually, it would have taken years and would have been a very, very difficult job. So analytics lets us cut through that very quickly. It's, I guess, for those of you that aren't, I guess, used to analytics or used it in the past, the main purpose of analytics is to help identify outliers across the data. So some examples might be looking for duplicate bank accounts, i.e. an employee and a vendor having the same bank account, missing fields within employee master files or vendor master files, looking for ghost employees or ghost vendors. So, you know, are there missing key fields like phone numbers, tax file numbers, ABNs? Is the ABN and tax file number legitimate, or are they actually invalid? Some other kind of recent examples, we've been looking at some payroll for a client recently, and they were actually comparing pre-COVID and current COVID environment working hours to see if there was any changes there. And if there was, what they were, and whether or not that needed to drill down a little bit more. Data analytics is also being used now to help identify if there's any underlying issues within organisational culture. There's obviously a lot of studies where, you know, poor culture can lead to an increase in fraud and corruption. So I think that's a really good example of, I think a lot of people mainly think about data analytics around financial, but data analytics is certainly now being used on non-financial information to try and identify early, I guess, as a preventative strategy, any kind of change in organisational cultures. But as I said, this is certainly probably the biggest change I've seen in my career, is the work that's currently being done around DA, and I think it'll just continue to get better and better.
Yeah. We're coming short on time, so we might move forward to response. Investigation and case management around investigation has been particularly problematic, and I'm sure anyone that undertakes an investigation has suffered from this. We have now, for BDO Forensic, we've now taken on a case management database tool which effectively has allowed us to reduce investigation timeframes. Basically, you know, we can do more investigations with less resources. It's replaced individual evidence and brief management practices with a consistent and strategic methodology that we now employ. It's increased the quality of investigations that we do through, you know, evidence to offence element mapping, real-time evidence evaluation, automated brief checking, event chronologies, etc. Everything goes into what we do in the case management database, and it's led to efficiency that we could never have imagined. And I guess in the COVID sense, where remote investigations and remote interviews are becoming the norm, this is something, if you don't consider it, please look at it. Augmentation of technology-led investigations are the norm, and we've been, you know, I've heard people speaking about it for a long time. I've been talking about it for a long time. We're looking at every avenue we can. There's another software application we're looking at in terms of it deploys AI technology so that when we do interviews, it records the interviews at the time and it actually produces live interactive transcripts. We haven't launched it yet because we're doing some testing, so I won't tell you what. If you want to contact me offline, I'm happy to talk about it with you. This is where we need to go, and if you're not adopting a technology-led response in the wake of COVID-19, you're going to fall behind, and your investigations, as I said before, companies are saying they can't do investigations. Well, that's because they're not adhering to, you know, looking at alternatives around their technology applications. So the tip here is augmentation of technology wherever possible. Civil recovery is another thing that we are talking more to clients about. It hasn't been a focus in the past, and I don't know why. Maybe because I'm a lawyer, I look at things a little differently, but we are now focusing more on civil recovery. We talk to clients immediately about insurance, which we've done in the past. Do you have fidelity insurance in place to deal with the fraud that has occurred in your business? If you do, it might pay for your investigation. It might pay for some or all of your loss. Very important to consider that. Civil recovery as opposed to referral to law enforcement. So there's a subtlety here. If you want to go down the avenue of recovery, you have to know that once a criminal investigation is commenced by the police, any civil proceeding, and recovery is often a civil proceeding, can potentially be stalled until the criminal matter is finalised. Now, anyone that's ever had any exposure to criminal matters will know they can go for years, and your recovery may not occur for a very long time, and even then be virtually impossible by the end of that process. With civil recovery, it's a bit different. You can act immediately, and there are a number of civil remedies that may be able to be used to maximise your recovery in the initial phases. So things like freezing orders, they're called Mariva orders. They're used to restrain a perpetrator from dealing with specific assets, ensuring that they're able to satisfy any judgment made against them later. So basically, if in the instance I talked to you about with the $5 million fraud, we were able to seize a house, we seized over $100,000 in a bank account, we seized a Mercedes-Benz, a boat. The perpetrator in that case wasn't able to deal with those assets at all until the matter had been heard. So that's certainly a good civil remedy to have. Another one is a search order. So like a criminal search warrant, it's called an Anton Pillar order, permits ourselves and others to enter premises to inspect, remove, or make copies of any documents or other things that may be evidence against the fraud that was committed by you. The only edge to this is it can be quite expensive and you need to engage specialised lawyers to do it. But it does give you the opportunity, if we come in, and certainly if I go in and identify that funds have been channeled through a bank account and the proximity of time is reasonably close, I would recommend this over and above immediate law enforcement involvement. Now, I'm not saying don't involve the police. Certainly lodge a complaint with the police. They will take some time to deal with it anyway, but once that prosecution starts, everything that you have in train in terms of civil remedy will be put on hold. That's why we talk about it now more and more, and that's why it's important. The other thing we mentioned about remote interviews, remote investigations, remote investigations and by extension remote interviews, they are the new norm. We will see more of that, and the expectation from people that we deal with, especially clients, is that we will undertake these remote investigations moving forward, and I guarantee that will have to be your approach as well. I'll just mention some things that we've noted from our approach, and Andrew, I might get you to chime in here whenever you feel necessary. Communication. So, you need to communicate the methodology you're going to use when you're undertaking these remote investigations. You need to explain to whoever it is you're dealing with about how they're going to occur. Typically, they're going to occur on a format like Zoom. That's what we use, or we use MS Teams like. That has been very successful. You can share screens, etc. The technology platform is very important. I've heard of some people using WhatsApp and Skype and even Facebook, FaceTime, whatever it's called. I don't agree with that. Like, don't use social media platforms. Use platforms that are specifically designed for video conferencing. The other thing is around technology. Do you have any comments around technology? I'll just run through a list of things I've got here, Andrew, but I'll ask you to comment.
Yeah, I think you're right. Remote's becoming the new norm. In interviews was probably the first one, but right through to now, where our forensic technology teams are dialing in remotely, and imaging servers taking copies of emails and those sorts of things, which are all used in, I guess, the sorts of investigations we do, or copying accounting files. So I guess it's a bit like the old, I guess, COVID days where you kind of go in unnoticed, and normally we would do that traditionally outside of business hours, but nowadays, I guess with the investments of technology, we can do more and more remotely.
Yeah, and with your technology platform, sharing documents, a little bit of a trap that I fell into. So sharing an interview, sharing a screen, I should say, with my interview notes projected, because I hadn't tested the equipment prior to, so the person I was speaking to had access to my interview notes for about 5 minutes before I realized. So always check when you're using platforms that you understand what you're projecting is actually what you're projecting, especially when you're dealing with multiple screens. Simple things like recording. Typically you want to record conversations you're having or video conferencing that you're having. You need to tell the other person that you're recording the interview, and how you address that and how you communicate that is up to you, and it's a case by case, but it's very important that they're aware of that, because technology, if you're recording someone and you think, well, I'm going to do it on the slide because I want to capture what's said, you might be in breach of a state law, or alternatively, the person will probably know they're being recorded given the platform. They're usually very good like that, telling you if something's being recorded. I guess it comes down to, and the big takeaway for remote investigations and remote interviews is about rapport building. As a seasoned investigator, you'll understand that the crucial aspects of rapport building are so vital to the success of any interview and subsequently any investigation, that they need to be a focus. And it is very difficult building rapport with someone on a video call. So you need to plan it. You need to understand the person that you're speaking to. You need to spend a little bit of time before you get into the process to build their trust, to tell them, and I mentioned about telling whoever it is you're dealing with the process and the methodology. Find out a bit about them. Try to break the ice, because it's going to be very confrontational to be speaking to someone on a computer screen. It's not going to be the right environment to elicit information. So you need to basically build that rapport. It's been the hardest aspect of doing these remote investigations that I have found. So I'm just passing that on as a bit of advice. Take the time up front to get to know the person, to knock the rapport down a couple of notches, because if you don't build trust, the interview is going to be very difficult, and that's going to hinder your investigation. Do you have anything about that you've experienced, Andrew?
No, I think that's good, sound advice.
Yeah, even down to, and just on this point, another thing is about dress. There was someone that I was interviewing, and this guy was in his pajamas. Now he was just a witness, but I found it a little bit. I honestly found it a little bit off-putting, despite the fact that I was sitting there in a shirt and tie with boxer shorts. I certainly found his demeanour, and he was very dishevelled. And this person was actually a C-suite member, so he was a CFO. Remember your dress as the interviewer, as the person that's dealing with or conducting the interview / investigation. You need to present yourself, even if you are on a video and on going through a computer screen. The fact that you are dressed appropriately is important. I guess this goes back to rapport building as well. Just a couple of little tips that we've worked our way through, and then there are many others. And in fact, we have a long list of things. So if you do require some help in this regard, please reach out to Andrew or I, and we're happy to share our mistakes and some of the things that we've been putting together to approach this. I guess the last thing I'd say about this is it really comes down to, now more so than ever, the experience of the investigator. Conducting remote investigations, remote interviews, really relies on the experience of the investigator. If you have a very junior member doing it, there are mistakes going to be made, and it is not going to be done with the effectiveness as someone who has a lot of experience. And 30 odd years doing this, it's even challenging for me. But I don't put my staff who don't have any experience or much experience through that process, and it's a real learning curve. So don't make that mistake. And we are well over time, so I'll go straight to the takeaways. So what are we seeing as the key takeaways from what we're talking about here? Bringing it all together, I guess. There needs to be awareness. Regulators are going to be. Andrew, do you want to talk to that? Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, for me, that's probably the main takeaway today is awareness. I think traditionally what we've seen is a lot of organisations and boards sometimes have a bit of an attitude, oh, it won't happen to us. The reality is we see it happen every day. But what we see more often is in tough times, again, like the GFC, or times like now off the back of COVID, we actually see an increase. Now, that increase may not be come to fruition straight away, but I think certainly towards the back end of this quarter or the back end of this year, we'll really start to see those fraud and corruption matters start to bubble to the surface. So again, for me, probably the biggest takeaway today is the awareness and be proactive and jump on it now and not after the horse has bolted.
Yeah. To the backroom conversations we're having with the regulators, they're quite mindful they're going to be judged retrospectively when all this becomes a thing of the past, if it ever will. So you can expect enforcement by regulators to come back online, and that they will be pursuing, as I've alluded to, where you have programs in place and you deliberately haven't followed them. There'll be no excuses. The other big ticket item, obviously, is the government stimulus. Okay, there's a lot of fraud being committed around that. That's no surprise. But when that stimulus gets withdrawn gradually, the cases, we're expecting the cases of fraud and to corrupt conduct and other misconduct to increase phenomenally. So it's more important now than ever to be thinking about what your response is to that coming, and to revisit your fraud risk assessment on the back of that. And I guess the last point, what we've most recently been speaking about, is just the fact that remote investigations and interviews are here to stay. Whether you like doing them or not, they are a thing of the norm, and they will continue. So understand how to approach those. And again, if you've got any questions around, you want to learn about our lessons learned or other things, we've got a checklist. Happy to provide that to you. So reach out. And that's it from us.
Thank you. As Adam said, we're happy to take any questions either now or offline, but feel free to reach out, and thanks for everyone for taking the time to log in and listen to us.
Feel free to email any questions by all means. We'll get back to you as soon as we can, seeing as we've gone over time. All right, thank you for your attendance today.